Two psalms appear. Oh, let me just click that. Okay. Two psalms appear to have as their central theme the interpretation of or a reflection upon a particular verse from the book of Exodus. The verse is part of a text that is so important to the biblical authors and composers that it is echoed in a variety of ways in a number of biblical passages. Both of these psalms use a similar version of the verse in question, but each understands it in a radically different way. Both address the nature of the relationship between God and the people of Israel, the rest of humanity, and creation. Is the use of the same verse in each psalm merely a coincidence, or evidence of a debate between rival views of a significant traditional teaching about the attributes of God? The verse that provides the basis for both psalms is Exodus 34, verse 6, and the psalms in question are Psalms 103 and 145. Psalm 145 has a prominent place in traditional Jewish liturgy. It is recited 3 times a day, twice in the morning service and once as an introduction to the afternoon service. Psalm 103 has a popular musical setting that is used in the High Holy Day services within progressive Jewish circles. And some verses on the transience of human life feature prominently in memorial services for the dead. Psalm 145. Psalm 145 was one of the first texts that I studied when I began examining biblical poetry from a literary perspective. At the time, this approach was very different from the prominent historical critical and form critical methods. So it became important to be as precise as possible in defining my methodology. Since then, such literary studies have become mainstream. So I find myself revisiting my earlier work and expanding on it. While teaching this psalm, I had already been aware that the 8th verse was the variant on Exodus 34, verse 6, though with a couple of obvious changes. In that Exodus passage, God passes before Moses and proclaims how divine compassion and forgiveness can be a response to wrongdoing by the people. But alongside this come warnings about the limitations of that compassion in certain circumstances. The first part of the text proclaims that God has in the Hebrew original the following qualities: El rachum v'chanun, erech apayim v'rav chesed ve'emet. God is compassionate and gracious, long-suffering, and great in faithful love and truth. Let me now put up the share screen and look at slide number 4. I apologize that this is in Hebrew, but I try to explain some things as I go along. There are a variety of ways of translating the individual terms in that sentence. Even if you are unfamiliar with Hebrew, you may be able to hear that the first 2 words share a similar vocalization. I'm looking here in red at rachum v'chanun, rachum chanun, a similar vocalization, and they are bound together by the conjunction vav here. This combination makes them effectively a hendiadys, a combination of 2 words creating a compound idea greater than the sum of the individual parts. Rachum, this first word here, rachum, expresses an attitude of love and compassion, whereas chanun, the second word, means to act with generosity and grace, giving to others simply for its own sake. Thus together, Rachum v'Chanun, they describe God's unbounded, universal, and limitless love that expects nothing in return. The second pair of words at the end of a sentence, here in blue, chesed ve'emet, also share a similar vocalization, chesed emet, and also the conjunctive vav, which ties them together. So this suggests that they too are a hendiadys, but together they describe a very different kind of love. The word chesed has no exact equivalent in English, so it is sometimes translated as loving kindness or mercy. The meaning seems to be the faithful and enduring love and loyalty that should exist between the partners in a covenant. This covenant can be as simple as what binds people together within a family, or as complex as a political treaty binding two nations. The point is that a covenant is both a legal contract and a personal, emotional commitment and loyalty between the partners that goes beyond the merely legal component. The former is illustrated by the loyalty of Ruth to the family of Naomi in the book of Ruth, chapter 3, verse 10. And on an individual basis, in the covenants between David and Jonathan, for example, in 1 Samuel 18:3, 20:14, 23:18. The latter form is exemplified by the covenant between God and Israel, beginning with the conditions defined in Exodus 19, verses 3 to 6. Now, the second word in that list, so that's chesed, the second word, emet, derives from the familiar biblical word amen, which means that something is firm, reliable. And in this form, emet means both truth and trustworthiness, something which is true and can be trusted. In this combination, emet reinforces the obligations that belong within the covenant relationship, the love, loyalty, and faithfulness that bind the partners, God and Israel, to one another. This juxtaposition of the two contrasting images of love within the same sentence suggests that there are circumstances in which God's unbounded, limitless love does have constraints and limitations. The covenant implies that there are requirements and duties regarding human behavior, and therefore sanctions can apply if people are not willing to live up to them. We will remind ourselves of what conditions apply when we examine the continuation of the Exodus passage later in this paper. Most notable in the version of Exodus 34:6 in both Psalm 145 and 143 is the omission of the concluding word of the Exodus sentence, emet, truth. This word emet is omitted in the two Psalms we are studying. This suggests a softening in both Psalms of the strictness of the sanctions, and this will be taken considerably further in Psalm 103. Regarding the opening phrase in the Exodus passage, Rachum v'Chanun, Psalm 145, verse 8, so here is Psalm 145, verse 8, the opening phrase reverses the order here. So in Exodus 34, it's Rachum v'Chanun, but in Psalm 145, it is Chanun v'Rachum. But these two words are, for some reason, inverted. So gracious and compassionate is the Lord, long-suffering, and so the text of Psalm 145 reads, Chanun v'Rachum Adonai, Erech Apayim u'Gadol Chesed. Gracious and compassionate is the Lord, long-suffering and filled with faithful love. So why are the first two words reversed, from compassionate and gracious in Exodus to gracious and compassionate in Psalm 145. The answer presumably lies in the practical reason that Psalm 145 is constructed as an alphabetic acrostic, with each verse beginning with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So verse 8 of the psalm should begin with the Hebrew letter chet, the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which also happens to be the first letter of the word chanun. So there is the letter chet. Above, rachum v'chanun in Exodus, and that word beginning with chet comes down here, there. So it could simply be that this change of order, which need not materially affect the meaning of the phrase, is simply to allow it to be utilized at this slot in the alphabetic form. While teaching this psalm and revisiting it, I remember that Psalm 103 contained a similar version of the Exodus verse, and perhaps coincidentally in the same slot, the 8th verse of the psalm. Since Psalm 103 is not arranged alphabetically, there was no need to reverse the opening phrase, and the Hebrew text follows the word order in Exodus. So in Psalm 103, Rachum v'chanun is the same as in Exodus, Rachum v'chanun. Rachum v'chanun Adonai, erech apayim v'rav chesed. Compassionate and gracious is the Lord, long-suffering and great in faithful love. Now, I would like to offer an overview of the structure of Psalm 145. Again, some more Hebrew, I'm afraid. The beginning introduces God as the king. So at the beginning of Psalm 145, the word Hamelech, the king, is at the beginning of Psalm 145 in verse 1. It uses the word Melech, and that sets the scene for what is to be the central theme of the psalm, that God is king. And this central theme is quite literally the case because the 3 central verses of the psalm, verses 11 to 13, include 4 times the noun malchut, derived from melech, king, which is variously translated as kingdom, kingship, or rule. Now, since the psalmist deliberately chose the alphabetic form for the psalm, I would argue that locating this emphasis and this word in precisely these 3 central verses was also deliberate. Just to clarify what's this picture in front of you, the 3 letters of the root word melech, king, interesting in Hebrew, the alphabet mem, lamed, kaf are equivalent to the English alphabet K, L, M. It's the same basic original sound. Kaf, lamed, mem, and K, L, M show the parallel between the English and the Hebrew alphabet. But there is a little trick here, a literary trick, that these 3 central verses are based upon the letters K, L, M, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, and these same 3 letters backwards spell Melech, king. So it's a kind of joke by the psalmist, but the 3 central letters which emphasize the word Malchut, kingdom, Malchut here, Malchutecha, Malchuto here, and now Malchutecha, Malchut. So 4 times the word Melech in the central verses, all of which begin with the letters of Melech. Yeah. It's nice to know that the psalmist had a bit of fun, Tenosh Katades, to do that. So let's go on. To translate the text, they shall speak of the glory of your rule, Malchutecha, and talk about your power, to let all people know of your mighty acts, and the glorious splendor of your rule, Malchutecha. Malchuto, sorry. Your rule, Melchutecha, Malchut, your rule is an everlasting rule, your authority for every generation. Now, having recognized this structural feature, it is legitimate to look for other such elements in the composition of the psalm, elements of structure. And if we now look at verses 1 to 3, a psalm of praise of David. I will extol you, my God the King, and I will bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and highly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. Now it's notable that this theme and a number of specific words used in these three verses, and we'll look at them in a moment, reappear in the final verse, verse 21. My mouth shall speak the praise of the Lord, and let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. Now, one approach to analyzing a biblical poetic structure is to look for repetitions of key words that help define certain ideas or components. Now, in the Hebrew text, I find it helpful to highlight such words using colors so that they stand out. Even if one does not have access to the Hebrew, you can see the connection. So, within verses 1 to 3, we have the verb baruch, to bless, twice in blue. So here is the verb baruch and baruch in blue. And it reappears in verse 21 there. Okay, so likewise the word Shem, meaning name, Shimcha, your name, Shimcha, your name, referring to the name of God in red, is in verse 21. Shem, you can see the reappearance here. Similarly, the verb halal, to praise, and the derived noun tehillah in yellow, so the verb here in the form halala, I will praise, mahulal, praised, and tehillah, the noun praise in yellow, reappear, of course, in verse 21. And finally, the phrase in green, leolam va'ed, leolam, forever and ever, reappears in verse 21. Effectively, verses 1 to 3 and 21 form an inclusio around the psalm. The emphasis in the opening part is the praise that I, the psalmist, bring to God. And at the end, not only does my mouth bless and praise God, but all flesh shall likewise bless God's name. So we have a clearly defined beginning and end to the psalm. And in the opening verse and the three verses in the center, the topic, the praise of God's divine rule over humanity. Now we go to another overview of the structure. We've got the opening and the closing, and in the center, God the King. So can we find other patterns of formality within the psalm? Now, I have to say, with this literary approach to any biblical passage, we are making a number of assumptions. Firstly, that we can trust the integrity of the received text, subject to any obvious irregularities or difficulties of understanding the meaning. Secondly, that we try to avoid allowing our contemporary assumptions about the nature of a literary text, perhaps especially poetry, to impose an artificial structure upon it. And this also means becoming sensitive, insofar as it is possible, to the literary conventions available in the biblical world. Thirdly, that we are open to recognizing where logical connections exist between elements or features within the text, and trusting our judgment about their relevance. And finally, that we are prepared to challenge our assumptions at all stages in the analysis. Now, with this in mind, let's look at verses 4 to 10, this section here. Okay, I will read the English text and you will have the Japanese there, and see if you can spot why verses 8 and 9 are different. I've marked out 4 to 7 and 10 as being somehow related to each other. See if you can spot yourselves why 8 and 9 might be slightly different. One generation shall praise your deeds to the next and tell of your mighty acts. The glorious splendor of your majesty and your wondrous deeds will be my theme. People will speak of the power of your awesome deeds, and I will describe your greatness. They will spread the fame of your great goodness and sing out loud of your righteousness. Gracious and compassionate is the Lord, long-suffering and filled with faithful love. The Lord is good to everyone. His compassion is over all he has made. All you made shall thank you, Lord, and those who love you will bless you. What struck me on repeated readings of these verses is that something distinguished verses 8 and 9 from those that surrounded it. Namely, both 4 to 7 and 10 are addressed directly to God in the second person. They express the praise people offer from generation to generation for God's deeds, powerful acts, splendor, awesomeness and greatness, goodness and righteousness, ending with their thanks and the blessing given by God's pious adherents. This second person list of praises is interrupted by verses 8 and 9, which, true to the presumed origin of verse 8 in Exodus 34:6, offer instead third-person statements about the divine attributes. And by adding in verse 9, God's goodness to all and compassion, rachamim, for all that God has made, both rachamim, compassion, verse 9, and chesed, faithful love, verse 8, are included together in this central part. So the verses in this section are arranged asymmetric. So basically, in verses 4 to 7, 10 people give something to God. They address God in that way. But in the middle verses, it's third-person description only about what the qualities, the attributes of God, and the emphasis is on God's compassion. Now the verses in this section are arranged asymmetrically because the four which precede this central part, 4 in front of it and 1 after it, are not symmetrically arranged, but we will discuss this later on. So we've got here a pattern. Now let's look at 14 to 20 and ask ourselves the same question. Is there anything which distinguishes these verses? Verse 14. The Lord supports all the falling and raises all those bent low. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food when it is time. You open your hand and satisfy the needs of all living. Righteous is the Lord in all his ways, and loving in all his deeds. The Lord is near to all who call him, to all who call to him in truth. He fulfills the needs of those in awe of him, hearing their cry and saving them. The Lord protects all those who love him, but all the wicked he destroys. Now the verses in this section, from 14 to 20, the verses in this section, following the central ones about God's kingship, can also be divided on a similar basis as 4 to 10. But this time, what helps separate them is that verses 14 to 16 and 18 to 20 speak of God's actions on behalf of and in response to the needs of others in general, presumably people or creatures. There is, however, a distinction in the second section from verses 18 to 20, where the recipients of God's favor are in more specific categories that we will discuss below. However, in parallel to the third person list of God's attributes in verses 8 to 9, verse 17 similarly has its own third person set of attributes, this time stressing God's righteousness at the beginning, and once again God's quality of chesed at the end. That's verse 17. The Lord is near to all who call him. 17. Righteous is the Lord in all his ways, and loving in all his deeds. Now, unlike the asymmetry in the former section, this one is symmetrical, as you can sort of see here, with 3 verses on each side of the central one. The pattern that emerges of a psalm as a whole can be shown in this simplified form. 1 to 3, in the first, I praise God the King. In the first unit from 4 to 10, here, people give to God, namely thanksgiving. And in the second unit from 14 to 20, God gives to people. God gives to people as they need. So the 2 sections are each interrupted by verses describing the eternal attributes of God. Each one has this break in the center of attributes of God. Once it's compassion and once it's righteousness. So the 2 sections are each interrupted by verses. So in the first group of attributes, we have the boundless love and faithful love, compassion. And in this other one, the attribute is primarily of righteousness and also, I think, chesed. Now, verses 14 to 16 seem to apply to all people and creatures in their time of need. However, as I mentioned, 18 to 20 differentiate certain categories of people who are defined by their closeness to God in their relationship, beginning with those who call to him, those who are in awe of God, sometimes translated as those who fear him. And the verse with the third category, those who love him, which comes here in these verses, ends rather dramatically and surprisingly with a shocking contrast. God guards those who love him, but destroys the wicked. We are suddenly reminded that God, like an earthly king, holds the power of life and death over his subjects. That when it comes to matters of justice and righteousness, there are limits to the divine compassion. Now, this is possibly a deliberate reminder of the missing part of the original Exodus passage, with its penalties for those who do not fulfill their responsibilities under the covenant relationship. Now, these 2 sections each describe a relationship with God, and a set of divine attributes are literally crowned in the center by the central verses of the psalm proclaiming the kingship of God. Perhaps the whole is intended as a description of the ideal, harmonious setting that should exist in a world ruled by a benign God. There is a rigorous transactional logic to the formality of the psalm's structure, using the alphabet as the controlling framework. The psalmist is taking seriously the requirements of a covenantal agreement with mutual responsibilities between the 2 partners, even though they are clearly of unequal power. The advantages, limitations, and conditions need to be abundantly clear. God is Israel's sovereign king. Now, the pattern above, called variously chiastic or concentric, occurs frequently in the Hebrew Bible, in both prose, poetry, and prophetic utterances. Now, it can be shown schematically as here, just simplifying the scheme. So the A and the B and C, etc., represent corresponding units of individual words, sentences, or even larger, the A and A stroke, B and B stroke, C, C stroke, represent corresponding passages which correspond to each other within this structure. Now, they may correspond in a variety of ways, as parallel ideas differently expressed, or as antithetic elements in debate with each other. The coincidence may be incomplete, and there is always a temptation to create a relationship or an artificial symmetry where none exists. We will return to this pattern after studying Psalm 103, whose structure is more elusive. Okay, so let's now turn to Psalm 103. Psalm 145 is consciously addressed to God, its rhetoric designed for attracting public attention. As we've read, it begins, I will glorify you, my God the King, and proceeds to do precisely this throughout the psalm, concluding that all creation shall bless God forever and ever. The author of Psalm 103, on the other hand, begins with what seems to be a private monologue addressed to himself alone. It begins David's, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is in me, bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, my soul, and do not forget all his generous deeds. Now, the word translated as soul, nephesh, means something like the life force, that which distinguishes a living being from one that is dead. But it can also stand for the self, the person, him or herself. Whereas the author of Psalm 145, from the very beginning, is consciously addressing the world, the author of Psalm 103 is inviting others to eavesdrop on his own private musing about the role of God in his life and ultimately in the world. So let's move to another Psalm 103, and perhaps something inevitable about it. One sec. So, like Psalm 145, it is contained within an inclusio. The opening is an appeal to himself to bless God. And here the word barachi, bless, barachi, addressed to the soul, which is the word nephesh is a feminine word, so barachi is a feminine imperative. Bless the Lord, my soul. Bless the Lord, my soul. But the end of the psalm, similarly, uses the same verb to bless. In verses 20 to 22, Baruchu Adonai, bless the Lord, Malachav, his messengers. Bless the Lord, all his hosts. Baruchu Adonai, bless the Lord, all he has created, he's made. And finally, Barachi Nafshi, Barachi is the same as the opening phrase. So he ends up with myself, my soul, addressing himself, bless the Lord. So just to show you, therefore, once again, the inclusio surrounding this psalm, as it were, bracketing it in. Now, I need to go on to a quick check now with Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. To understand, and we can perhaps, let me just see. Okay, one moment. To understand how radically different Psalm 103 is from Psalm 145 in its interpretation of the Exodus passage, we have to remind ourselves of the rest of the description of the attributes of God as given to Moses in Exodus 34, verses 6 to 7. We have noted that two contrasting aspects of the divine love have been expressed in Exodus 34, verse 6. One is boundless and unlimited, Rachum v'chanun, and the other is constrained within the framework of the covenant with Israel and God, Chesed ve'emet. The passage responds in concise and direct language to a major theological question. How can the God who is creator of the entire world and everything within it, the heavens and all their host, be personally engaged with the life of a particular people, let alone each individual person amongst them? The answer offered here is that God deliberately limits himself by entering into a covenant with the people of Israel, and thereby indirectly with the whole of humanity. For this to work, there are conditions that must be met. It will depend entirely on the readiness of the people of Israel to do their part through their behavior to one another, to others, and to God, in order for this extraordinary contract to be maintained. Now, these conditions are introduced by the specific language in the closing phrase of verse 6, our phrase, V'rav chesed ve'emet, great in faithful love and truth. And the terms of the contract are then spelled out in detail in the following verse 7. Notzeh chesed la'alafim, noseh avon va'fesha v'chata'a, v'nakeh lo yenakeh, poked avon avot al banim v'al bnei vanim, al shileshim v'al ribeim. God will show enduring love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity and rebellion and failure. But God will not simply declare the guilty to be guiltless, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon their sons and their sons' sons to the 3rd and 4th generation. The conditions begin with the promise that the divine chesed, this covenant love, will last for 1,000 generations. How is this love expressed? God will literally lift up, noseh, lift up, that is, remove and forgive different kinds of wrongdoing. They're listed with 3 separate examples, but together they indicate the totality of the kind of wrongs that people might do. The first, avon, where are we? Avon, usually translated as iniquity, seems to indicate habitual wrongdoing. The second, pesha, here, means rebellion, something that one does deliberately, knowing full well that it is forbidden. The third term, chata'a, is conventionally translated as sin, but it is the weakest of the 3 terms. Literally, it means missing the target, failure to live up to an expected standard of behavior. However, the next phrase firmly sets the limits on the divine willingness to forgive, and that is this phrase here, v'nakeh lo yenakeh. The Hebrew construction, v'nakeh lo yenakeh, literally means, but guiltless, he will not hold guiltless. The meaning of this is open to interpretation, but I would argue that because God is concerned with truth, God cannot forgive any of the above wrongdoing unless the perpetrators are prepared to acknowledge what they have done and undertake the necessary actions of repentance and reparation. Without such a condition and requirement, there can be no justice in the world. Now, to underline the seriousness of this condition, there follows the disturbing phrase that God visits the avon, the iniquity of the fathers, upon their children down to the 3rd and 4th generation. Now, to understand this phrase, it is important to remember that the person being addressed here is the adult Israelite male, the patriarch of a household. His legal identity includes his ownership of wife, children, and grandchildren, servants, land, and animals. In his lifetime, he may see not only children and grandchildren, but even a fourth generation of great-grandchildren. So this warning is not about the future. Rather, it means that his wrongdoing will have consequences on his person, which includes all those who legally belong to him or are descended from him, all those who are alive at this moment in time. He has the ultimate responsibility and duty of care for all of them. Now, the unfairness of this from the perspective of family members is addressed by the prophets, Jeremiah 31:29, Ezekiel 18:2 and 30, who argue that the children should not be held responsible for the wrong actions of their parents. Now, it is significant that in the numerous quotations of part or all of this Exodus text in the Hebrew Bible, with the single exception of Numbers 14:18, this final section here is omitted. We will now see how Psalm 103 goes even further and challenges this limitation that is set on God's compassion. Psalm 103 is not as formally constructed as Psalm 145. It is more fluid, with ideas flowing into one another. One way to approach it is to recognize certain key words that have become familiar to us from Exodus, that repeat themselves throughout the psalm. Just to list them, Rachum, signifying God's boundless love and compassion, is in verses 4, 8, and twice in verse 13. Chesed, the faithful love and loyalty of the covenant, is also in verses 4 and 8, and additionally in verses 11 and 17. Perhaps it is significant that each of these two key ideas occur 4 times, so that the balance between them is maintained. Of equal significance is the appearance of the 3 words for wrongdoing that God forgives according to Exodus 34:7. Avon comes in verses 3 and 10. Chata'ah, sin, or the weakest form, missing the target, is in verse 10, and Pesha, rebellion, in verse 12. And another phrase familiar from Psalm 145 is those who fear God, who are to be the beneficiaries of God's love, from both Chesed in verses 11 and 17 and Rachamim in verse 13. Now, there is one other word that is worth noting, the verb yada, which means to know. Verse 7 in Psalm 103, we don't have it here. I'll come to it in a moment. Verse 7 in Psalm 103 introduces the Exodus passage. He, God, made known to Moses and the children of Israel his deeds. This refers us back to Moses' plea to God to teach him, let him know God's ways, so that he will know how to continue to find favor with God. That's to say, we are quoting from Exodus 33, verses 12 to 13 in Psalm 103. This makes it clear that the psalmist is deliberately addressing this important event of the encounter between Moses and God and the conversation between them that preceded and led to it. The verb yada, to know, will recur in verse 14 of the psalm, where the psalmist movingly reminds us that God knows the frailty and transience of human beings. So let's go through the psalm. In addressing his self, the psalmist acknowledges all the ways in which God supports his life. God is the one who forgives all your iniquity, who heals all your sickness, who redeems your life from the pit of death, who crowns you with faithful love and compassion, who fills your old age with goodness, renewing your life like an eagle. God begins by forgiving all the psalmist's iniquities, thus already fulfilling the promise in the Exodus passage. Verse 4 concludes with 2 of our key words. God crowns you with chesed v'rachamim, the faithful love and the boundless love of the divine attributes. though previously separated in Exodus 34 verse 6, here they are elided into a single concept of divine compassion. Where are we? We don't have it here. No, okay. Sorry. I should have put that onto my PowerPoint. But let's go on. The use here of the verb to crown, we're talking about now verse 4. The use of the verb to crown elevates the experience of the psalmist as someone living in a special and highly valued relationship with God. Verse 6 and 7, the Lord does what is right and justice to all the oppressed. He made his ways known to Moses, his deeds to the children of Israel. Verse 6 introduces a further set of divine attributes, beginning with God's righteousness. And this is exemplified by the fact that God's judgments support all who are oppressed. Now we're clearly building up to the quotation from Exodus, so verse 7 introduces it by recalling how God informed Moses and through him the people about God's ways. And now with verse 8, Rachum v'chanun Adonai, erech apayim v'rav chesed, compassionate and gracious is the Lord, long-suffering and great in faithful love. But what follows, however, in verses 9 onwards, appears to be a remarkable challenge to the original formulation in Exodus, with its warning about sanctions and potential punishment for breaking the conditions of the covenant. Four emphatic, now let me just find the PowerPoint. Yep. Four emphatic, sorry, I've lost my place. Four emphatic repetitions of the word lo, here, lo, lo, which means no or not. 4 times repeated here. 4 emphatic repetitions of the word lo pound home the message. Lo lanetzach yariv, v'lo leolam yitor. Lo chachata'enu asalanu, v'lo cha'avonotenu gamal aleinu. Not for all times does he accuse, not forever remain angry. Not according to our failings has he dealt with us, not according to our iniquities requited us. Having taken this negative route, the rhetoric soars with a metaphor that places God's chesed, God's faithful love of those who are in awe of him, in the very heavens, and then adds that God's willingness to forgive even the most serious of sins is as wide and broad as the greatest imaginable distance on earth. Verse 11, for as high as the heavens over the earth, so great is his chesed, his faithful love, over those who fear him. And verse 12, as far as the east from the west, so far has he taken our pesha, our rebellious acts, from us. With verse 12, the psalmist has God remove the third and most serious of the wrongdoing listed in Exodus, pesha, rebellion. And the other two have also been forgiven in verse 10. The psalmist has proclaimed on God's behalf a comprehensive amnesty, far beyond what God had told to Moses. Now, at least 2 questions arise about this response. What might have been the circumstances that led to such a powerful assertion of God's mercy? And what aspects of God might have been invoked to explain it? The latter is answered directly with the following verse. Verse 13, in Hebrew, Kurachem av albanim, richam Adonai al yireav. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. In this verse, the verb for showing compassion is rachum, now familiar to us as the word chosen to express God's boundless, unlimited love in verse 8. It is that overwhelming love and compassion that a father feels for his children, but is now introduced as the relationship that God has for the people. Israel's behavior might have transgressed the strict requirements of chesed, the faithful love and loyalty expected by the terms of the covenant, but it is still possible to appeal to rachum, the boundless love of God that is always there to be found. What might be unforgivable under the strict letter of the law could nevertheless always be forgiven by a loving Father. Having opened up this image of the psalmist follows up the implications. God, who made known his qualities to Moses, also knows the nature of how human beings are formed, our transience and our ultimate fate. Quote, verses 14 to 16, "For he knows our formation, remembers that we are dust. Frail mortals, their days are like the grass. They blossom like a flower in the field, but a breeze passes over it and it is gone, and its place knows it no more." This evocation of human frailty and the brevity of our individual lives becomes the opportunity for the psalmist to contrast this with the enduring love of God that is so essential for our continued existence. He picks up two other aspects of Exodus 34, verse 7. God's chesed is timeless, present and available for 1,000 generations. Secondly, the psalmist challenges indirectly the idea that God visits the wrongdoing of the patriarch on his family. God will treat these generations with righteousness, and this specific reference to God's righteousness links us to its previous appearance in verse 6 as a general principle governing God's actions. Verse 17 and 18, "But the Lord's faithful love, chesed, endures forever and ever for those who fear him, and his righteousness to the sons of their sons," the second and third generation, "to those who keep his covenant, and to those who remember his laws to perform them." Now, I asked above, what might have led to such a radical reworking of the Exodus text? One suggestion is that the psalm was composed after the return of the exiles from Babylon. Thus it is a song of joy and praise for God's loyal restoration of his people to their land. But I detect in it a greater sense of urgency and the need to counter the belief of those who are convinced that exile or some other experience of suffering is proof that the covenant has been broken and God has abandoned them. Instead, the psalmist argues from his reading of the traditional teaching in Exodus that despite appearances, they should retain their faith in God's chesed and rachamim, that God's faithful loyalty and boundless love would eventually lead to restoration. The psalmist has evoked the cosmic dimensions of God's chesed, his faithful, enduring love, but juxtapose it with the parental intimacy, the rachamim, compassion, that God feels for weak human beings. The psalm has offered a creative reimagining of the paradox of these two dimensions of love existing side by side in the original Exodus verse. It remains for the psalmist to list the manifold layers of God's servants, from the heavenly to the earthbound, to the psalmist himself, all of whom offer their song of blessing to God. Perhaps it is not surprising that here too, however briefly, there is reference to God's throne and God's kingship, Malchut. But the theme that was so prominent in Psalm 145 is here merely noted. The Lord has established, verse 19 to 22, the Lord has established his kingdom in his throne in heaven, and his kingship reigns over all. Bless the Lord, his messengers, the mighty in strength who perform his word, obedient to his command. Bless the Lord, all his hosts, servants who do his will. Bless the Lord, all his creations, in all the places of God's rule. Bless the Lord, my soul. Now, it is possible to apply the concentric pattern to Psalm 103, but with some reservations. A stroke 1 to 2 blessing and 20 to 22, blessing. 1 to 2 and 2 to 20 to 22 clearly work as an inclusio based on the use of the verb barach, to bless. 3 to 5 and 19 express God's engagement with individuals on a highly personal level in B and as a general principle in B stroke. So in B and B stroke, those seem to work together. 6 and 17 to 18 introduce the idea of God's righteousness, tzedek, seeking justice for all oppressed and across the generations. So we might have a commonality here in the word for C for God's righteousness. But 7 to 10 and 15 to 16 don't seem to fit at all. As I indicated earlier, one should be cautious about attempting to force the various verses or units of a biblical passage into a predetermined structure of corresponding parts. In the above pattern, the sections marked D and D stroke do not seem to belong together, either through the repetition of key words or directly equivalent themes. But what is happening in verses 7 to 10 is a remarkable challenge to the original Exodus passage. It begins by contrasting the eternity of God and the transience of human life. God's anger with Israel does not last forever. The proof for this is the evidence that God has not punished the people in the past as it seems that they deserved. That's back to our 4 lows. Not according to their sins has God punished them. And this idea takes its next breathtaking leap in verses 11 and 12, moving from the dimensions of time to that of space, vertical and horizontal, and the almost unimaginable power of God's chesed to forgive. From that perspective, when God views human beings, it is their transience and weakness that he sees, for he views them with the compassion of a parent. So it is possible to see verses 7 to 10 as starting with a recognition of human wrongdoing that needs to be addressed by God's forgiveness, and then returning to it in verses 15 to 16, as if locating the source of their wrongdoing in the transience of their lives. Nevertheless, the hierarchy of power is maintained as we move to the ending, with the myriad servants in heaven and earth, in heaven and below, that serve God, and like the psalmist, offer their blessings. 11 to 14 is the center of the psalm. The composer of Psalm 145 located God at the center of a formally constructed universe as the ideal king. Instead, Psalm 103 uses spatial imagery, as high as heaven, as distant as the horizon, to describe the vastness of God's compassion. The composer of this psalm locates God in this central position not as the ideal king, but instead as the ideal compassionate father. Conclusion. So we end as we began. 2 psalms offer radically different interpretations of the passage in the book of Exodus about God's self-revelation. Psalm 145 focuses on God as king, supporting his subjects as part of a formal transactional system. Care is given to all that are in need, and gratitude and praise are given by them in return. For the author of Psalm 103, instead, God is the Father, who, because of his feelings of love for his children, respects their independence, but knows only too well their frailty. Such a father will always forgive them, however far they stray from the path that he wishes them to follow. If Psalm 145's universe is transactional, Psalm 103's universe is existential. It is evidence of the spiritual imagination of the composers of the Psalms that 2 such contradictory images of God can be derived from the same textual source. But it is also proof of the wisdom of the editors of the Psalms that two such diverse understandings of God can exist side by side. Both may be needed in different times and circumstances. Together, they offer different possible responses to the ever-changing needs, challenges, and self-understandings of a living community on its journey through history. Thank you. ちょっと長い。ごめんなさい。So I presume we hand over to someone to regulate the questions and whatever.
マゴネット先生、どうもありがとうございました。これから、須藤一郎先生の、私、進学部学科主任の日原博と申します。本日はようこそおいでくださいました。これから質疑応答の部に移ります。質問は、事前にメールでもお伝えしましたけれども、手を挙げるボタン機能を、ご利用ください。Zoom 画面下のバーの参加者という絵をクリックすると、右側に参加者リストが表示されます。その右下に点々点というボタンがありますので、それを押して手を挙げるというところを選択していただきますと、ポスト側のリストにお名前が挙手マークとともに一番上に上がってきますので、質問していると識別されます。順番に指名しますので、指名が来たらミュートを解除して質問を始めてください。質問は簡潔にお願いします。質問が終わりましたら、挙手マークを手を下ろすボタンで消してください。はい。それでは、はい。日高義彦先生、どうぞ。
こんにちは。どうも。マゴネット先生、どうもありがとうございました。I have two questions about footnote in the English version.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Footnote number 5 and number 9. First of all, number 5, you write that why the noon is missing in this chapter 145. And could you tell me some midrash about why the reason why the noon is missing, omitted from this chapter? And another question. Let us ask two questions first.
Well, let me deal with that one first. Just
okay,
to
okay.
Yeah, okay.
Please wait a moment. Professor Hidaka, please say your question in Japanese.
すみません。質問2つあります。脚注に関する質問です。で、1つはちょっとなんか日本語のあれと英語の中の番号ちょっと違うみたいなんですけども、私、英語の、文章では5番と9番について質問があります。で、なんか1つずつということだったので、5番から、この145編は、いわゆるアルファベティックアクロスティック、イルハウタっていう、アルファ、ABC から言って、で、最後の22文字で終わってるっていう、そういう詩なんですけれども、どういうわけか、ヌンだけが落ちてるっていうことです。私も実際数えたら、ヌンが落ちてるんですね。それで、なぜヌンが落ちてるのかっていうことについて、このフットノートを見ると、ラビたちがいろいろなことを言ってるというので、ちょっと私興味があったので、一体ラビがどうしてヌンが抜けているっていう説明をしているのかっていう、説明を、ぜひ知っていたら教えていただきたいということが最初の質問。
Okay. Yeah. Yes. First of all, nobody knows why the letter nun is missing.
まず第一にですね、これどうしてヌーンのところが抜けてるのか誰も知りません。
In the Septuagint, I think, and Targum, there is a verse is inserted to fill that gap.
ギリシャ語訳ですね、70人訳聖書ではここに一節が補われていると思います。
But the one verse which the rabbis thought might have been removed was actually a verse from the book of Amos, chapter 5. I think it's verse 2. Yeah.
ラビたちが一つの説が動かされてるんじゃないかと言ってるのは、アモス書の5章2節です。
Now, that verse in Amos begins with the letter Nun.
アモス書の5章2節は、このヌーンの字で始まっています。
And the verse begins, Nafla lo tosif kum betulat Israel. She has fallen and will not rise again, the virgin daughter Israel. It's a threat about the destruction of Israel, who has fallen.
その彼女はもはや起き上がれない乙女イスラエルは倒れてしまっているという、そういう内容です。
So the rabbis, some rabbi at some point thought that this was such an unhappy idea that they removed that verse because it threatens that Israel will fall.
で、何人かのラビたちは、この説は内容がちょっとあまり好ましくないというか嬉しくないものなので、イスラエルがもう倒れてしまうんじゃないかみたいなことを言ってますので、それで取られちゃったんじゃないかって言ってます。
And the peg for that being the right verse is that in the Psalm 145, the first verse after the missing nun is verse 14, which begins, Somech Adonai lechol hanoflim. God lifts up all who fall. So clearly that's why the word noflim, fall, works well with Amos.
それで詩編145編の14節は、それをうまく元に戻すような内容になっています。で、145編の14節はですね、日本語訳でいくと、主は倒れそうな人を皆支え、うずくまる人を皆立ち上がらせると。ですから、その倒れている人を神様が起こしてくださるというので、なんとかリカバーできる内容になっているということなんですね。はい。
I have to add that the rabbis enjoyed manipulating these texts.
ちょっと付け足したいと思いますけれども、ラビたちは、この本文を操作することで、楽しんでいると思います。
So the Amos chapter 5 verse 2, they read in a slightly different way than usual.
彼らはですね、アモス書5章2節を普通とは全く違った読み方をしています。
Now, the traditional reading of that verse is Nafla, which means she has fallen.
で、この伝統的なそのアモス書のその箇所の解釈の仕方は、まずナフラーと彼女は倒れた。
Right? And after the word Nafla comes Lo tosif kum, she will not rise again.
で、その続きはですね、彼女は二度と立ち上がらないだろうとなります。
But the rabbi said you can also break up the sentence in a different way.
ラビたちはしかし文章を違うように区切って読めるというふうに言ってます。
Because there is no actual punctuation in the original text.
その元々のその区切り方ですね。で、これはちょっと示されてないので、解釈でいかようにも区切れちゃうわけですね。
So they divided it as follows. Nafla, she has fallen. Lo, no, tosif kum, get up again, rise up.
それでそのラビたちはですね、まずナフラーと彼女は倒れたと。で、次にローだけ読んで、そうじゃないと。で、彼女は立ち上がるんだと。立ち上がれないとは読まなくて、立ち上がれると読むわけですね。はい。
So, but back to your original question, why a verse is missing, there may be other reasons why they don't want to complete the alphabet and just omit, they do it elsewhere once, they omit one of the letters of the alphabet. And it might just be a fear of magic, that if you're working with something which is perfect and complete, it might give you, you might have some kind of problems. So take out one of the letters of the alphabet, rather like a Persian carpet, remove a couple of strands, because it shouldn't be perfect, because the gods get jealous.
はい。じゃあ、どうしてね、このヌーンで始まる一節がないのかってことなんですけれども、おそらくは、ちょっと魔術的な思考になるんですけれども、あまりにも完璧なものはちょっと危ないと。神がですね、ちょっと妬ましく思ってしまって、神様を怒るといけないので、わざと不完全にしていると。一つだけ抜けるようにしてるんじゃないかってことです。
So the second question, perhaps.
And the question is footnote number 9.
Yeah.
Yeah. I asked, I couldn't understand one word, non-Israelites, in this passage. You mentioned that three groups. The first one is the people of Israel. The second one, the priesthood. And the third group is the worshippers of the Lord. And in Hebrew, Yireh Adonai, beside after the priesthood. And you mentioned Psalm 118, verse 4 and 105, 11 as a evidence verse. Sorry. And you said that the third group is the people from within Israelites or non-Israelite. I don't understand why non-Israelite. And you refer to the chapter 11, 118 verse 4 and 115 verse 11. And I read both chapters, and I found these words, the goim, in the both chapters. For example, 118 verse 10. All goim sevanuni. All nations surround me as an enemy. And in 115 verse 2. Lama yomer hagoim aye na Elohim. Why the foreigners, goim, said, where is God? It means that a foreigner is, you mean a non-Israelite is an enemy. They don't understand the God of Israel. But why you said that the third group is Israelite or non-Israelite? Your theory or some Jewish tradition said like this. This is the question.
Okay. So 日本語で。
日本語でね。この9番の質問、フットノートの9番の質問なんですけれども、この主を恐れる者っていう、主を礼拝する人たちっていう用語が、
すみません、日本語訳では9ページの脚注の16番になってます。はい。日本語では脚注16番。
そこで、マゴネ先生のあれだと、まず最初にその3つのグループが登場すると。で、最初にイスラエルの旅、2番目が祭司、そして3番目がその主を恐れる者っていうか、主を礼拝する人、主に近くある人たちっていう。で、その人たちのことをさらに、それはイスラエル人だったり、あるいはノンイスラエル人だったりする可能性があるというふうに説明を加えておられるので、実際この118編と115編を読んでみると、例えば118編の10節では、すべてのゴイームですね、そのイスラエルでない人たちが私を取り囲んでいると、自分はもう滅ぼされそうだっていうふうに言ったり、あるいは115編の2節では、どうして異邦人はあなた方の神どこにいるんだっていう、要するに敵対しているわけです。そういう文脈の中で、118編、115編も118編も、そういう私が読むとそういうふうに感じるのに、先生はその2つの箇所を引用して、これが第3グループがイスラエルだ、 あるいはノンイスラエルの人たちの、証拠だっておっしゃるので、ちょっとそこら辺のことを教えてほしいという、先生個人的な意見なのか、あるいはユダヤ人の中にそういう解釈があるのかっていう、そこら辺のことを教えてほしいということです。
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, it's always dangerous including footnotes. people take them. Some people take them seriously.
Yes.
いつもなんですけれども、脚注に何か書いてしまうというのはちょっと危険なんですね。ちょっと人々はそこを狙ってつついてきますので。はい。
But very the phrase Yirei Adonai, those who fear God, it is not clear generally to whom that is referring.
ちょっと今音声が乱れたので、よく分からなかったんですけど、この主を恐れる人々というフレーズは、意味が必ずしも明らかではないものです。はい、
So it is possible that they are non-Israelites who have come to accept Israel's God, but are not themselves become Israelite people. They are visitors to that culture.
で、一つの可能性は、この主を恐れる人たちっていうのは、イスラエル人ではない人たちですね。で、非イスラエル人、異邦人であって、しかし、この主なる神のもとにやってきていて、で、訪問者って言ったらいいですかね。訪れている人たちで、彼ら彼女らがイスラエル人に、なってるわけではない。しかし、関心を持ってやってきていると。
And since these references are about the temple, remember that Solomon, in his opening, when he opened the temple, invited foreigners to come and visit and to become and to worship there.
ここはその文脈が神殿という設定になっていますので、ソロモンがその神殿を建てた時の言葉を思い起こすべきだと思うんですね。で、彼は異邦人たちにやってきて、で、その神様を礼拝しましょうっていうふうに呼びかけてるんですね。
And if you look at Psalm 96, it very explicitly says it invites the families of the peoples to come to the temple and to bring an offering in the courtyards of the temple. That's to say, we tend to read this as a kind of generalized invitation, but it could also be a specific welcome to a delegation of non-Israelites coming to worship in the temple. I think we should take it sometimes more literally. So I think there are such people who belonged to, who came to worship Israel's God without becoming part of the people themselves, the nation itself.
で、例えば詩編の96編にはですね、イスラエル人以外の人たちにこの神殿にやってきてくださいというこの招待の言葉があるんですよね。で、神殿にやってきて、そして礼拝をして捧げ物を捧げましょうというようなね。で、これはその、一般的な意味だけではなくて、具体的に使節団を送ってくださいというような意味にも読み取れると思うんですよね。で、実際そういう人たちを招いて、でそういう人たちが来て、でだけどもその人たちはイスラエルの民に改宗して加わるってことではないわけですよね。はい、
Okay, that's the best I can do for now, I think. Yep.
Yes, thank you.
これが私の今答えられる最上のものです。はい、どうもありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございました。続きまして、ファム・ナムドク先生、お願いします。ファン先生、ミュートを外してください。
すいません。はい。私も、Jonathan 先生、how are you? So, my question is very short and simple. 私の質問が簡単です。There are two kinds of image of God in Psalm 103 and 145, respectively, as God as Father and God as King. So God as Father is God is righteousness, compassionate, and God is a king. God is righteousness. So there are two kinds of image of God. So, but how can understand? How can appreciate God in the age of COVID-19? Of course, you conclude that both may be needed in different times and circumstances. So we are living very, very difficult situation. We are living in COVID-19. So what kinds of image of God is needed? So in the age of COVID-19, so after COVID-19, post-COVID-19, so-called, what kind of image of God you need? So that is my questions. Because we have to repent before God, and we have to rebuild our new relationship with God and with nature. So what kind of image, God as Father or God as King, are needed?
日本語で、
はい、ですね、詩編の103編と145編で、この2つの神のイメージ、2つのタイプがあるというお話でした。で、この憐れみ深い父のイメージ、それからその正しい王というね、2つですね。で、私がお尋ねしたいのは、この新型コロナウイルスの時に今私たち直面しているわけですけれども、この難しい困難な状況においてはどのような神のイメージがこの求められているでしょうか。そしてこのコロナ後ですね、ポストコロナの時にどのような神のイメージを私たちは語ることができるんでしょうか。
I'm glad that's a simple question. In fact, as always, they're usually the hardest.
私はこの簡単な質問っていうのが、はい、大好きです。で、大体いつもその簡単な質問っていうのが一番難しいんですね。
Yeah. And in a way, your question is probably better addressed to the book of Job than it is to the book of Psalms.
で、あなたの質問はですね、この詩編よりも、呼ぶ記の方が、それに答えるにはふさわしいと思います。
Because how to understand tragedies, disasters in human society is beyond it is beyond our understanding, and therefore all we can do is speculate and in some cases then let me start again, because this is a very difficult and a much more complex thing than we can discuss, I think, in the time available. So let me just give a different model to start with.
すみ
ません、須藤先生。
Once more,
forget it. Let me just do it.
Yes.
Okay. There are things which can only be known or understood by God, and which we can only make our own personal limited speculations to understand.
この神によってのみこの知られているで答えられる事柄っていうのがあるわけですね。で、私たちの限られたこの理解では極めることはできないことはあるわけです。
one of the lessons of Job is that we cannot control God, but we can control how we respond to what God does in the world.
呼ぶ記から分かることはですね、まず私たちは神をコントロールすることはできない。しかし私たちはその神がおっしゃることを行われることに対してどう答えるか、私たちがどう答えるか、それをコントロールすることはできる。
The rabbis noticed that there was a distinction between Abraham and Noah in two biblical texts.
ラビたちはですね、このアブラハムとノアが、違った行動をとっているというこの2人を区別しています。
In Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, it says that Et ha-Elohim hitalech Noah. Noah walked with God.
創世記の6章9節には、ノアは神と共に歩んだと書いてあります。
But and I don't think I can find it immediately. When God is speaking once to Abraham, he says, "Hitalech lefanai," walk. In Genesis 17, verse 1, God says to Abraham, "Hitalech lefanai," walk before me.
創世記の17章1節では、神がアブラハムにおっしゃいました。私の前に歩みなさい。
So the rabbis asked, what's the difference between walking with God and walking before God?
ラビたちはこの神と共に歩むというのと、神の前に歩む、神の御前で歩むという、この、わずかな違いを論じているのです。
And they said it's like a king who had two sons.
で、ラビたちはですね、これは次のようなことだと。で、王が2人の息子を持っていた。
To the one who was very young, he said, "Take my hand and walk with me."
で、1人はとてもまだ小さくてですね、で、その王に向かって、私の手を取って、歩いてくださいと。で、くっついていくわけですね。はい。
But to the one who was older, he said, "Walk before me, lead the way."
で、もう一人の方は年上で、そのお父さんの王に向かってですね、私の前を歩いてください。私はついていきますからというわけです。
And I think that the only answer I can give you is that there are times when we need to hold that hand and walk with God. And there are times when we need to accept our independence and walk before God and not simply and lead the way, find our own answers to these sorts of questions.
で、2つの仕方があるということなんですよね。で、私たちが神の手につかまってですね、しがみつくようにして、導いていただいて連れてっていただくっていう時と、それから私たちは私たちで自立性を持って、神を前に仰ぎながら、しかし自分で方向を見定めながら歩んでいくと、そういう時と2つあると思います。
I can't do more than that. I think it's a difficult question and the time is short, so that's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
で、これとても難しい質問で、この短い時間では私がお答えできるのは、以上が精一杯です。
ありがとうございます。
どういたしまして。
Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。それでは、時間となりましたので、質疑応答の時間はここまでにしたいと思います。講演者のマゴネット先生、そして通訳をしてくださった須藤一郎先生、本当にありがとうございました。
ありがとう。どういたしまして。ありがとう。And,
学部長の浜野先生に返します。
はい、今日は皆様ありがとうございました。たくさんの方々集まってくださってありがとうございます。進学部では、コロナ、最後ね、ファン先生が質問してくださったように大変な時代、私たちは一緒に過ごしてますけれども、しかし、それがおかげで私たちはこうやってズームで、どこに住んでいても共に聖書を読むときに、慣れてきた、つながり合うことにやり方に慣れてきたともまた言えると思います。進学部ではこれからもさまざまな方法を通してまだ皆様と一緒に、聖書を読み共に語り合っていく時が持てればと願っておりますので、どうぞこれからもよろしくお願いします。マゴネット先生ありがとうございました。
Thank you.
はい、これで時間になりましたので、今日の学術講演会を終わります。皆様ありがとうございました。
Magonet先生、thank you so much.
Thank you, and Matarainen. Next year, not in Jerusalem, but in Fukuoka. I've just heard a bell. Excuse me, I have to go. So bye-bye and thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.